The sun had long set, leaving only a thin crescent moon to guide me down the endless stretch of highway. The air outside my car was cold, autumn's chill creeping through the cracks in the window. My GPS had long lost signal, and with no phone service, I relied on instinct to navigate the winding, isolated back roads that cut through the vast, empty countryside. I'd been on the road for what felt like hours, the miles of unlit highway stretching endlessly ahead. The distant glow of my dashboard clock told me it was nearly 10 p.m., and I was growing more tired with every passing minute. The occasional bump in the road caused my heavy eyelids to flicker, forcing me to stay alert. I hadn't seen another car in almost an hour, and the isolation was starting to weigh on me. My stomach growled loudly, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since that quick snack at a rest stop early in the afternoon. As if responding to my need, a faint, flickering glow appeared on the horizon, barely visible through the fog that now blanketed the road. It took a few moments to realize it was a sign, the familiar neon hum growing louder as I approached. The red and blue letters spelled out, "Bill's Diner, open 24 hours. Relief washed over me, although there was a subtle undercurrent of unease. The diner stood alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but endless fields and a thick wall of trees in the distance. Something about its solitary presence was unsettling, but I was too hungry and tired to let it stop me. As I pulled into the gravel parking lot, the crunch of tires on loose stones was the only sound in the stillness of the night. No other cars were parked outside, and the lights inside the diner were dim, casting long shadows across the checkered floor visible through the large front window. A gust of wind blew past as I stepped out of the car, and for a brief moment it felt like something was watching me from the nearby trees. The bell above the door jingled as I pushed it open, the sound oddly loud in the quiet night. I stepped inside and was immediately hit by the strong smell of greasy food, stale coffee, and something else. Something sour that lingered just below the surface. The diner was nearly empty. In fact, there wasn't a single customer in sight. The booths were all vacant, the red vinyl seats torn and worn from years of use. A soft, old-timey tune played faintly from a jukebox in the corner, but the air in the diner felt heavy, as though it had been sitting stagnant for a long time. Despite the dim lighting, the atmosphere felt dark. I hesitated near the entrance, glancing around. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the silence. A moment later, the door to the kitchen swung open, and an older woman in a faded pink waitress uniform stepped out. Her appearance was as tired as the diner itself. Her gray hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and her expression was one of forced politeness, like she had repeated this routine for far too long. "Evening," she said, her voice rough like she'd smoked too many cigarettes over the years. "Take a seat anywhere. I'll be right with you." I nodded and slid into a booth near the window, glancing out into the dark parking lot. My car was the only one in sight, and beyond it the thick fog seemed to shift and move like it was alive, swallowing the road behind me. When the waitress came over, she handed me a laminated menu that looked older than I was. The pictures of the food were faded, the edges of the menu frayed, but the options were standard diner fare. Burgers, sandwiches, fries, and breakfast served all day. "I'll have a cheeseburger and a coffee," I said, my stomach growling again as I handed the menu back to her. She gave a short nod, not making eye contact, and disappeared into the back. As I waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The jukebox continued to play, but now the song sounded warped, the notes twisting in a way that made my skin crawl. I looked around the diner again, noticing little details I hadn't seen before. The way the lights flickered slightly, the strange stains on the floor near the counter, and the odd lingering smell that grew stronger the longer I sat there. As I sat there, trying to distract myself by looking at my phone, though there was no signal, the door jingled again, and a man walked in. He was tall, his features shadowed by the dim lighting, but there was something immediately off about him. He walked with a strange, shuffling gait, his shoulders hunched as though he was carrying the weight of the world on his back. He didn't look at me as he passed by my booth and took a seat in the far corner of the diner, where the shadows seemed to cling to him like a second skin. His presence only added to the strange atmosphere of the place, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The waitress returned with my coffee, setting it down with a clink of the cup hitting the saucer. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed it in front of me, and for the first time I noticed a deep scar running across the back of her hand, jagged and angry, as though it had never properly healed. "Your food'll be out soon," she muttered before retreating back to the kitchen without waiting for a response. I took a sip of the coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. It was burnt, as if it had been sitting on the burner for hours, but I drank it anyway, trying to shake the growing sense of unease that gnawed at me. I glanced over at the man in the corner. He was staring straight ahead, not moving, not ordering food, just sitting. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I began to wonder if I'd ever get my food when the man in the corner suddenly spoke. "You shouldn't have stopped here." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried across the diner like a cold breeze. I looked up, startled, and saw that he was staring directly at me now, his eyes dark and hollow. "What?" I asked, my voice sounding small in the emptiness of the diner. "You shouldn't have stopped here," he repeated, his gaze unwavering. "This place isn't what it seems." Before I could respond, the kitchen door creaked open, and the waitress returned carrying my plate. She set the cheeseburger in front of me, her expression unreadable, but I could feel the tension radiating from her. Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the back once again. I stared at the burger on my plate. The meat was gray, and the bun looked hard and stale. My stomach churned at the sight of it, but I was too hungry to care. I took a bite, immediately regretting it as the cold, tasteless meat filled my mouth. I pushed the plate away and glanced back at the man in the corner. He was still watching me, his eyes filled with something that looked like pity. Or was it fear? As I sat there, the oppressive silence grew heavier, broken only by the occasional flicker of the lights and the low hum of the jukebox. The shadows in the diner seemed to stretch, creeping closer with each passing minute, as if the darkness itself was alive. Something was wrong with this place. The man's warning echoed in my head, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Not yet, not without knowing what was happening here. My eyes drifted toward the kitchen door, which now hung slightly ajar. Through the crack, I could see movement, shadows shifting and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. I leaned forward, trying to get a better look, but the door suddenly slammed shut with a loud bang, making me jump in my seat. "Don't." The man's voice cut through the silence again. "Don't look." I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not just by the man in the corner, but by something unseen, lurking within the diner itself. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse with an unsettling rhythm, as though they were alive, waiting for something to happen. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, but I stayed frozen in my seat, my eyes glued to the kitchen door. The man's words echoed in my mind. Don't look, but what was I supposed to do? Act like nothing was happening when clearly everything was wrong? I glanced back down at my plate. The burger, which had once looked gray and unappetizing, now seemed worse, more like a slab of raw meat than a cooked meal. Blood seeped from the edges of the patty, pooling on the plate beneath it. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was undeniable. I felt my stomach turn, and then the menu on the table caught my eye again, as though I was seeing it for the first time. It wasn't the same worn, faded list of typical diner fare I had seen when I walked in. No, this menu was different. The images were sharper, more vivid, but there was something deeply wrong with them. Instead of burgers and fries, there were strange dishes listed in small print. Roasted flesh sandwich, grilled soul of the lost, blood pudding special. The photos that accompanied them were disturbingly realistic, grotesque images that made me feel physically ill. My breath hitched in my throat, and I quickly shoved the menu away, my hands trembling as I pushed it to the far end of the table. I didn't want to look anymore. I didn't want to be here anymore. Leave. The man's voice came again, this time more urgent. His face was still shrouded in shadow, but his eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, wide with terror. Before it's too late, before it takes you too. My heart raced as I glanced back at him. What do you mean? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the low hum of the diner's failing lights. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, his eyes never leaving mine. "This place isn't real," he said quietly, the words dripping with fear. "It's a trap, a prison for people like us, travelers, wanderers. It waits until we're too tired, too hungry, and too lost to think straight. Then it pulls us in." My skin prickled with goosebumps as his words sunk in. "A prison? A trap? How could that be?" "You're not the first," he continued, "and you won't be the last. Everyone who stops here—" He trailed off, his gaze shifting to the shadows creeping along the walls. "Everyone becomes part of it." I glanced nervously at the clock hanging above the diner's counter. The second hand ticked closer to the 10 p.m. mark, and an eerie sense of dread filled the air. The man in the corner tensed, his eyes locked on the clock as if he knew something terrible was about to happen. "Get out," he hissed suddenly, standing from his seat. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like his body was struggling to follow his commands. "You have to get out now." The lights in the diner flickered again, and this time they didn't come back on. The room was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the neon sign outside. The jukebox sputtered, the warped tune slowing to a stop, leaving only the sound of my own panicked breathing. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest as I backed away from the table. The shadows in the diner shifted, growing larger, and I could swear I saw them reaching for me, like long, inky tendrils creeping along the floor. I turned to run, but my feet felt heavy, like they were sinking into the floor. The door to the diner seemed impossibly far away, and with every step I took, the wall seemed to close in around me, trapping me inside. I sprinted toward the door, my legs pumping as fast as they could, but with every step, the distance seemed to grow. The man's voice echoed in my head. "You're not the first." Was I trapped? Was this diner some kind of nightmare that I couldn't escape? I slammed into the door, gripping the handle and yanking it open. But what lay beyond wasn't the gravel parking lot I had seen when I arrived. Instead, it was a vast, empty void, darkness stretching endlessly in every direction. The fog that had surrounded the diner had thickened, wrapping around the building like a suffocating blanket. A sharp wind blew through the open doorway, cold and biting, carrying with it whispers, inaudible at first, but growing louder and louder until they filled my ears. They were voices, countless voices, all murmuring the same words over and over. "You shouldn't have stopped here." I stumbled back, slamming the door shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I turned to find the man standing just a few feet away from me, his eyes wide with fear. "There's no escape," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Not once you've entered." In a panic, I looked around the diner. The shadows were growing thicker, more tangible, creeping closer with each passing second. The walls seemed to pulse, almost breathing, as if the diner itself was alive, feeding on my fear. The waitress appeared from the kitchen again, but something was different this time. Her once tired, worn expression was gone, replaced by a sinister smile that sent chills down my spine. Her eyes were dark, hollow pits, and the scar on her hand seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. "You've been chosen," she said, her voice no longer rough and weary but smooth and cold, like ice sliding over my skin. "It's time." I backed away, my heart racing, but there was nowhere to go. The diner was alive, and it wanted me. I stood frozen in place, my back pressed against the cold wall of the diner, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of escape. The shadows writhed around me, growing thicker and darker with every passing moment, like a living mass creeping toward me. My breath came in short, panicked bursts, and the air seemed to grow heavier, making it harder to breathe. The man in the corner was still watching me, his face twisted in fear. He had warned me, told me to leave, but now it was too late. The diner had me in its grasp. I took a shaky step forward, but as I did, the floor beneath me seemed to shift. The once solid tiles now felt like quicksand, pulling me down, making every step harder than the last. The walls around me pulsed, the strange rhythm matching the pounding of my heart. "I can't stay here," I muttered to myself, my voice barely audible. "I have to get out." But where could I go? The door led to nothingness, and the windows were blocked by the thick fog that had surrounded the diner. It felt like I was trapped in some kind of twisted nightmare, with no way out. I turned toward the man in the corner, desperate for some kind of help, but his face had changed. His eyes, once filled with fear, were now wide and hollow, his skin pale and clammy. He no longer looked human, his features distorted and grotesque, as though the diner itself had begun to consume him. His body slumped forward, collapsing onto the table in front of him. The shadows swarmed around him, wrapping around his limbs like tendrils, pulling him deeper into the darkness. I watched in horror as his body seemed to dissolve, becoming part of the diner itself. A cold wave of dread washed over me. Was this what awaited me? Was I destined to become one with this place, just like him? "No," I screamed, backing away from the scene. "I won't let it happen." But deep down, I knew I was powerless. The diner had chosen me, and there was no escaping its grasp. The waitress appeared again, her once friendly smile now a twisted grin that sent chills down my spine. She stepped toward me, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were savoring the moment. "You're special," she said, her voice smooth and cold. "Not everyone makes it this far. Most are taken before they even realize what's happening, but you're different." I shook my head, backing away from her. "I don't want to be special," I muttered. "I just want to leave." Her smile widened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "But why leave when you can have everything you've ever wanted?" she asked, her voice dripping with temptation. "This diner is more than just a trap. It's a place of power, a place where anything is possible. You can have wealth, fame, power, whatever your heart desires. All you have to do is stay." I stared at her, my heart racing. Her words echoed in my mind, and for a moment, I was tempted. What if she was telling the truth? What if this place could give me everything I'd ever wanted? But then I remembered the man in the corner, his twisted, grotesque form becoming part of the diner. I remembered the whispers, the shadows, the suffocating darkness. "I don't want your offer," I said, my voice shaking. "I just want to leave." The waitress's smile faded, her eyes narrowing. "That's a shame," she said coldly. "No one leaves the diner." Without warning, the lights in the diner flickered once again, plunging the room into darkness. I could hear the sound of chairs scraping across the floor, the distant hum of the jukebox warping into a twisted, eerie melody. And then, I felt it, the presence of something lurking just beyond the edge of the darkness. It moved swiftly, silently, stalking me from the shadows. My heart raced and I turned to run, but the floor beneath me shifted once again, making every step a struggle. I could feel the darkness closing in, the shadows reaching out for me, pulling me deeper into the diner's twisted grasp. I sprinted toward the kitchen, hoping to find some way out, but the door slammed shut in front of me, locking me inside the dining area. I turned back, only to find the waitress standing in front of me, her eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "There's nowhere to run," she whispered, her voice sending a shiver down my spine. But I refused to give up. I wouldn't let this place take me. Desperation fueled my every move as I darted toward the counter. I had seen the door to the back storage room earlier. Maybe there was an exit there. My legs ached, and my lungs burned with each breath, but I couldn't stop. Not now. The diner seemed to shift around me, the walls moving like living creatures, distorting and changing with every step I took. I reached the storage room door and yanked it open, stumbling inside. It was dark and cold, the air thick with the smell of decay. Boxes were piled high, casting eerie shadows in the dim light that filtered in through the cracked ceiling. But at the far end of the room, I saw it. Another door. My heart leaped with hope. I ran toward the door, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. But just as I touched it, the door vanished, replaced by a solid wall. I gasped, spinning around to find the shadows creeping into the room, inching closer. "No! No! No!" I screamed, backing away from the advancing darkness. The shadows wrapped around me, their cold tendrils snaking up my legs, pulling me toward the center of the room. My mind raced, searching for a way out. But there was none. The diner had won. I was trapped, And then, just as the darkness threatened to consume me completely, I heard a voice, soft and distant, but unmistakable. "Remember who you are," it whispered. For a moment, the shadows hesitated, and I realized something. This diner fed on fear, on hopelessness. But if I refused to give in, if I held on to my sense of self, maybe I could still escape. With a newfound resolve, I pushed back against the shadows, refusing to let them drag me down. The darkness recoiled, but it wasn't done yet. The walls of the storage room shifted, revealing the waitress once again. Her eyes filled with anger. "You can't win," she snarled, stepping toward me. "This place is eternal. It will consume you just like all the others." But I shook my head. "No," I said, my voice steady. "I won't let it." The darkness surged again, but this time I fought back. Every step I took pushed the shadows away, and slowly, the diner began to fade. Suddenly, I was back in my car, the sound of the engine humming beneath me. The diner was gone, the fog had lifted, and the open road stretched out before me. I sat there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. It was over. I had escaped, or so I thought. For a moment, I stayed there in the car, staring at the road ahead. My heart still thumped erratically, but the oppressive weight I had felt inside the diner was gone. The fog, the shadows, the waitress, they had all vanished as if they had never existed. But I knew better. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. 10 p.m. How was that possible? I had been inside the diner for what felt like hours, yet no time had passed. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it all. With trembling hands, I reached for the ignition key, ready to drive away and never look back. But as I turned the key, the car wouldn't start. The engine clicked, sputtered, and then fell silent. A sinking feeling crept into my stomach. Something was wrong. I stepped out of the car and scanned the area. The highway was deserted, the only sound coming from the rustle of the wind in the trees. But there was something else. A faint hum, barely audible but persistent, as if the air itself was vibrating. And then I saw it. Scratched into the paint of my car, barely visible in the dim light, were symbols. Strange, twisted markings that glowed faintly in the darkness. They pulsed like veins, alive with some unseen energy. I stumbled back, my heart racing. These markings hadn't been there before. They were fresh, as though someone or something had etched them into the car while I was inside the diner. I looked around, fear gripping me once again. The road was empty, the diner nowhere in sight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was still out there, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. Suddenly, a soft voice broke the silence. "You thought you escaped, didn't you?" I whipped around, and there she was, the waitress, standing in the middle of the road. Her once friendly appearance was gone, replaced by something far more sinister. Her eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, and her smile was twisted into a mocking grin. "You're marked now," she said, stepping closer. "You'll never leave." I backed away, my mind racing. What did she mean? I had escaped the diner, hadn't I? "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" She continued, her voice dripping with malice. "The diner isn't just a place. It's a curse, and once it has you, it never lets go." I stumbled toward the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the door handle. But as I pulled on it, the door wouldn't budge. It was as if the car had become part of the nightmare, just like the diner. "You're one of us now," the waitress whispered, her voice chillingly close. I turned to face her, my back pressed against the car. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice breaking. Her smile widened, and she reached out, her fingers brushing against my arm. A searing pain shot through me, and I cried out, collapsing to the ground. "You'll find out soon enough," she said softly. "Welcome to the diner." The pain subsided, and I opened my eyes, only to find myself back in the diner's booth, the soft hum of the jukebox playing that familiar, eerie tune. The waitress stood behind the counter, polishing glasses as if nothing had ever happened. The clock on the wall read 10 p.m. My heart sank. There was no escape.